Many people find it hard to accept a few people could orchestrate a whole global pandemic hoax. But in fact, when we understand the structure of how the world's controlled, it becomes relatively straightforward. I've talked for decades about a global cult, what some call the 1%, a global web of interconnected strands of secret societies, semi-secret groups, and then in the public arena, government agencies. And all of these groups appear on the surface to be unconnected. They aren't. You can symbolize the way this global web works as the structure of a global corporation. Say McDonald's with a headquarters at a point in the world, and in every other country you have the subsidiaries that operate according to the centrally dictated headquarters. And so you go into a McDonald's in Russia, South Africa, Australia, America, Britain, and you're basically going into the same McDonald's operating in the same way. And this global cult structures itself in very similar lines. At the center of the web, and this is in the shadows, you have what I call the spider. This is the inner core of the cult that is driving the direction of the world. And then in each country, they have a subsidiary network, certain families and secret societies. Their job is to impose the will of the center, the spider, dictating policy in virtually every country. And in each of these subsidiary networks, on a national level, you have the pyramids of government and politics, banking and finance, pyramids of media ownership, and the pyramids of the medical system. So if you take health policy, the few at the top in each country are dictating how doctors and the rest of the medical profession have to act, what they have to do. The medical profession then follow overwhelmingly, unquestioningly. And those who do question and resist find themselves and their careers in often serious trouble. And the top of these pyramids in each country answer to the same master globally, the spider. And therefore the will of the spider is dictating what the policy will be right across the world. Just the people at the top impose it upon the pyramid structure in its entirety. So if we look globally at this pandemic, first of all, so important, forget borders. This cult does not have borders. They are for the public. This cult is global and operates globally. And one of its biggest centers is China. The cult was behind the Chairman Mao revolution that turned China into this fascistic, communistic, they're the same thing really, tyranny. And what they've done behind the walls of that tyranny is incubate a system that they want to play out globally. China has become a fiercely controlled country, not least controlled via technology, with millions and millions of face recognition cameras which allow the Chinese authorities to find anyone, often literally in minutes, in real time. In the West, until now, they've had to pay some lip service to freedom and democracy. Only in theory, but they have to, or have up to this point, have to hide behind that propaganda. So the West has been able to move, until now, slower than China in terms of rolling out this fierce, draconian, Orwellian, fascistic control system. But in China, the authorities decide what's going to happen, and it just happens. There's no democracy or lip service to freedom to have to deal with. And so in China, it's moved very, very much faster. And the time has come where the cult wants to play out the Chinese model of control right across the world. Ask yourself, what has the West become far more like since this pandemic hoax? China, and becoming more so all the time. So this is how the pandemic, or what has become known as the plandemic, was played out. First of all, you have people taken ill in Wuhan, China. And people ill in Wuhan is extraordinarily common, given that Wuhan has appalling toxic air, which generates a lot of respiratory problems. And so when these first people started showing symptoms of illness, a handful of them were tested, and they took lung fluid and decided it was caused by a virus. But they never isolated and purified it in and of itself without any other contamination or genetic material. Now, if you're going to prove that a virus exists, and you're going to prove that that virus causes an alleged infectious disease, then purification and isolation of that viral material is an absolute solid gold foundation must do. It's never been done. What you then had in those early days was COVID-19 being diagnosed on symptoms. And what were the symptoms? Flu-like symptoms. Flu-like symptoms, respiratory symptoms in Wuhan. Are you having a laugh? But it was all on symptoms. And suddenly, symptoms that were coming from other sources up to that point were redesignated this virus, which they'd never isolated, purified, and shown to exist. They then start developing this test called the PCR test, and the creator of the test, called Kerry Mullis, in the 1980s, actually said this test should not be used to diagnose infectious disease. But that's exactly what's happened ever since. So now they started adding to the diagnosis by symptoms with a PCR test that wasn't testing for the virus they were claiming to exist. It was testing for an RNA genetic material that was found in the lungs of those people, but has endless other sources and possibilities for why it's there. The key was the response. They wanted to have the Chinese response of a fierce, draconian lockdown to be the response of the rest of the world. The figures were going up of cases and deaths, but the cases were coming from assumption of symptoms and the test not testing for the virus. And the deaths were coming from this redesignation, and the numbers went up. They were building hospitals in a matter of days to cope with the hysteria and the crisis. People were shown on video just collapsing in the street. Have you ever seen anyone collapse in the street in the West from the same virus? So they locked down these areas of China with absolute tyranny and inhumanity. And the numbers very quickly started falling, which when you're controlling the numbers by your diagnosis and your test not testing for the virus, is very easy to push the numbers up and then push the numbers down. Suddenly these hospitals in next to no time that were built to cope with the crisis, they were shut. And you had the World Health Organization, via its Bill Gates-controlled Director General Tedros, who was been on the payroll of Gates organizations. He comes out and said China is the way for everyone else to respond. Gates came out and said something similar. And Gates has been the second biggest funder, second only to the government of the United States, of the World Health Organization. And if Trump carries through his threat to stop funding the WHO, then Gates will be the biggest funder. He owns it. And he owns Tedros, the Director General. So then we start moving into the West, and the same process unfolded. As people were told, and the medical profession was told, this virus is spreading, they started to diagnose it on the basis of symptoms, just like in China. And then they introduced the PCR test, and it's not testing for the virus they say that it's testing for. The death numbers did not match what we were told about the deadly nature of this virus. And China was still a long way away in the minds of most people in the West. It was still somewhere on the other side of the world. What the cult needed was a Western example to frighten the hell out of Western people. They wanted and needed a Covid-19 crisis that Western people could relate to the point of, whoa, if it can happen there, it can happen here. And they chose Italy, an area called Lombardy, which is notorious for its toxic air and its respiratory disease, just like Wuhan. And the country was locked down. The official government figures in Italy revealed that 99% of people said to have died from COVID-19 had one or more other morbidities, reasons to die. But everyone was now designated COVID-19, and there seemed to be a crisis when old people were dying of things that old people have always died from in that area. And a health spokesman for the Italian government would later come out and say, actually, we were, quote, generous on designating deaths as COVID-19. In his view, in truth, only about 12% of the people said to have died from COVID-19. And yet, the media were full of the hysteria to frighten the hell out of Western people. And so in different countries, the same process unfolded. You had dark suits, not even politicians, driving the policy. Politicians were saying that we're being guided by the science. Well, who were the scientists? Well, in Britain, you had someone called Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer, who has big financial connections to Bill Gates. In America, it was Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx that have big financial connections to Bill Gates. And because they didn't have the death numbers, they had to produce projections to justify the lockdowns, which were in the plan from the start, the Chinese response. So along comes Professor Neil Ferguson and Imperial College in London, big financial connections to Bill Gates, with computer models projecting ludicrously, anyone could see it at the time, that 500,000 people could die in Britain from this, quote, virus, and up to 2 million people in America. And as a result of that, the countries were locked down because the computer modelers said, if you don't have lockdown, then this is what's going to happen. And lockdown has since killed far more people than any virus, even if you believe it exists. And it's transformed human society. And it's been done by this global web which operates in every country and controls the pharmaceutical health pyramids in each country. And the few at the top have had the same policy being driven from the center, the spider, which includes being told to designate almost anything that moves, COVID-19, to the point where in the United States they even introduced financial incentives. So a hospital that diagnosed someone as regular pneumonia got $4,600, but you designate someone with the same symptoms, COVID-19 pneumonia, and you get $13,000. And if you put a COVID-19 pneumonia diagnosed patient on a ventilator, you get $39,000. And so many of these people put on ventilators for no reason have died. So that's the structure of how this pandemic, officially pandemic, hoax has been played. And it's what is driving the policy day by day to transform human society into what they call the new normal, the great reset, the great scam to transform life on Earth.